Hi, I'm Dr. Jonathan Lasson, and today I'm going to talk to you about multicultural psychology. I've been teaching multicultural psychology classes for the past several years, and I feel that this is perhaps one of the most important classes to teach in any environment, whether it's business, medicine, law, but especially in the field of mental health. Because multicultural psychology, which is defined as the systematic study of behavior, cognition, and affect in settings where different populations interact. And that's what our world is. Our world is about interacting with different populations. And we start to think and we start making assumptions about those different people in the population that we live in. And that is usually for what we're dealing with, the great United States of America. A melting pot, as they call it. Before we talk about multicultural psychology and worldviews, I just want to share with you something that you might have seen before, but this is called the Harmonic Grid. Now, if you look at the grid, you might just see a bunch of black rectangles on a white backdrop. But if you look a little bit harder, or as Rafiki would say from The Lion King, look harder, you'll notice that there are what? What do you see? Well, I'll give it away to you if you haven't seen it yet, but if you look really hard and just stare, you'll notice in between the boxes that there are these shaded gray circles. And if you look at those 50 shades of gray, well, I don't know if there are 50 of them, but it's just the title of the book. But if you just saw the grid like this, you would just assume it's a bunch of black rectangular boxes or rectangles. But if you look harder, you see something else. And that's really what this course is all about. It's looking a little bit harder and understanding a person's worldview. And a worldview is just basically a psychological perspective of the environment that determines how we think, how we behave, and how we feel. So by looking at somebody, for example, if you were to go into a bar and you take a look at the people that are sitting at the bar, you sort of gravitate towards certain people and you want to stay away from other people. That's just based on the assumptions that we make, which could be about their disposition. And we make those assumptions which are sometimes faulty, and we're going to talk about that shortly. But understanding that we all come from different cultures and understanding the idea of inclusivity and diversity, these are topics and terms that I want you to become familiar with throughout this class. Before I get into the actual class, I want to just tell you a quick story of a man who they called Old Ed. Some people refer to him as Crazy Old Ed. Now, who was this Crazy Old Ed? What did he do? Crazy Old Ed lived in an area around the seashore. And every single Friday night, Old Ed would walk to the edge of the pier holding a bucket full of shrimp. And he would carry this bucket full of shrimp every single Friday night to the edge of the pier. And he would wait a few minutes, and then he would look up into the sky and he would see thousands of white little dots. And he would look at these white little dots, and then the white little dots would come closer and closer to him, and before you knew it, Old Ed was engulfed by thousands of seagulls waiting to get their meal. And Old Ed would feed them the shrimp from the bucket. And he would whisper. If you went close enough, you would hear what he was saying. He was saying to the seagulls, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And to the observer, Old Ed looked like an eccentric old man who maybe had a few screws loose. That's what one would assume. But if you looked a little bit harder and you had a conversation with Ed, you would know that Ed had a story that actually made him quite popular. And Ed, his real name was Edward Rickenbacker. Now, for those of you who don't know who Edward Rickenbacker was, he was the founder of Eastern Airlines. He was also a jet fighter. He flew airplanes. He was an ace. And what happened was that when he was fighting in the war, he was lost at sea with a lot of people, a lot of his friends. And they were on a raft and they had a little bit of food, but not enough food that would last them because nobody was coming to find them. They were lost at sea. And they got to a point where the food had run out and they all sat together and said a prayer. And then all of a sudden, Edward noticed this white bird sitting on top of his head. And he quickly grabbed the bird, killed it, and fed it to his mates. And after they had their share of food, they took the insides of the bird and they made bait to catch other fish that was in the water. And this is how they survived. For 24 days they were lost at sea, but they survived because of the smart thinking. So, understanding this story, you'll see that Edward, when he was whispering thank you to the seagulls, he wasn't just a crazy old man, or a crazy old bird, pardon the pun. He was somebody that understood that the seagull had saved his life, and gave up his life, basically, to save him and his cohorts. And that's Edward Rickenbacker. But sometimes we look at men, we look at women, we make assumptions about them, and those assumptions could be faulty or they could be true. And this is our worldview. Again, that psychological perspective of the environment that determines how we're going to think about them, how we behave, and how we act, how we feel. And there's a lot of diversity within the environment. And diversity are those differences beyond race and ethnicity and nationality, such as sexual orientation, religion, ability. That's what diversity is. That's what it's all about. And that's what we hope to accomplish with this class. Now, before I go on, I just want to do something, an exercise that I typically do with my classes when I teach multicultural psychology. I try not to put students on the spot, but I don't mind putting myself on the spot. So what I typically would do would be, I would have the students, after a while, so you've been looking at me for 7 minutes and 42 seconds right now. You've seen me standing up here and talking about multicultural psychology and worldviews and culture and diversity. And you've probably already made an assumption about the person who's standing right in front of you. Now, some of those assumptions might be true, and some of them might not be true. But just as we gave with the example of going to that bar and finding that person that you want to gravitate towards and avoiding the people that you want to stay away from, those are all based on assumptions, which can be faulty or not. So, for the next 30 seconds, I want you to formulate some assumptions about the person that's standing in front of you, talking in front of a camera. During COVID-19, not much else to do, so I'll talk in front of a camera. And I want you to make some assumptions about who I am. And just think about it, write them down on a piece of paper, and then we'll regroup. So I'm just going to stand here. I'm going to walk back. I'm going to walk forward. Just as if I would be teaching a class. Sometimes I pace, but I can't pace too far because I got to be in front of the camera. Okay, so now that you've written down some assumptions, I hope, I want you to think about those assumptions, and I'm going to try to debunk some of the assumptions that you might have made. So, one assumption that people probably make is that here I am as a Caucasian male with a beard. That would be a correct assumption because that's what you see. Your eyes are not defying you. This is not an optical illusion. This is a real person. But you also might make some faulty assumptions. So I'm curious to know what your assumptions are, but since I can't get feedback right now, I'll just have to debunk what I think that you might have assumed. Well, the first thing you probably assumed was here I am wearing what's called a yarmulke, and that would be a correct assumption to assume that I am Jewish, because Jewish people sometimes wear yarmulkes. Now, not all Jewish people wear yarmulkes. In fact, only about 10% of all people who identify as being Jewish would be wearing one of these. So you might see somebody else think that they're not Jewish because they're not wearing one of these, and really they are. Okay, but I am Jewish. That would be a right assumption if you did say that I am a Jewish person. But let's say you said, well, you must not be married. And I've done this with a lot of classes before, and that's a typical one that I get. Now, why would people look at me and assume that I'm not married? What do you think? Well, as I moved around, you might have taken a closer look and looked at my hand, and you didn't see a wedding ring. And if you didn't see a wedding ring, it must mean that I'm not married. Now, let's say I told you that that was a faulty assumption. You would say, well, why aren't you wearing your wedding ring? So I could make something up by saying that, well, my fingers are a little bit swollen, it's cold outside. But no, that's not what's really going on. The truth is that in my culture, being a religious Jew, most religious Jewish men do not wear any jewelry. And that's the reason why I'm not wearing a wedding band. But I am married. Now let's say you didn't know this about me, and we went on having this class, and week after week after week, you thought, here was a single Caucasian Jewish man teaching this course in multicultural psychology. How would that have affected the way that you interact with me? Now, some of you would say it doesn't have any effect. But let's say I was talking to you about marriage and the culture of marriage. Now, some of you might have thought, like, well, it's kind of strange that he's talking about the culture of marriage being a single man. That's if you had made the assumption that I was single. So, now that I've explained that I am married with 6 children, so it might give you a different idea or perspective of who I am, or who this person is that's standing in front of you. Another assumption people generally make is they assume that if I'm religious, that must mean I'm politically conservative. Now, I would have to say that if anything, I'm very apolitical, because I don't really know too much about politics. I don't involve myself in politics. I don't discuss it in my classes. I don't discuss it with my friends because I can't consider myself someone that's very knowledgeable. I don't read the news too much. I don't follow the news. I prefer to listen to music. But I don't have any typical political persuasions. So, those are assumptions that people might make just about the person that's standing in front of you. Now, you can also say, well, is Dr. Lasson an introvert? Is he an extrovert? What are his views about different aspects of psychology that he's about to teach me? Is he going to focus on his culture only because he talked about the fact that he was Jewish? So all of these different assumptions are things that you would make just by looking at me and hearing me talk to you for a little bit. But you're going to see throughout this course that I'm going to challenge your assumptions, and this course will challenge your worldview and hopefully change your worldview. And you might say, well, my worldview is perfect. What do I need to change my worldview? Well, as one of my first psychology professors told me, he said that in general, personalities can't change and should not change. And in general, attitudes can change and should change. Again, personalities should not change and generally cannot change. Attitudes, on the other hand, can change and should change over time. So your attitudes towards a specific culture, whether it's older people, whether it's people that are handicapped, whether it's people from a certain sexual orientation or from a different religion, those should change and help you appreciate those cultures, understanding getting to know them, asking them questions. You'll learn a lot. Your whole worldview will change, and you'll become a better person because of it. Thank you.